Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today. Is your water system meeting its priorities? 4 metrics to calculate today. My name is Glenn Barnes, and I'll be your presenter for today. I'm the Director of Water Finance Assistance, and I'm so delighted that we have so many people joining us today to talk about this important water topic. Before we get started, a couple of logistical notes. First off, many of you are probably familiar with how GoToWebinar functions, but just in case you're not, I have on the screen a example of what your control panel looks like. So this little arrow at the top will help you open and close your control panel. And there are some options there, including the audio. And then most importantly, this is where you can ask questions. So please do type in questions at any time during the presentation. We will get to them at the end. We'll have plenty of time for that, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about our topic today. A couple of other logistical notes as people are joining us. First off, we will make a copy of the slides available to you for download after the webinar, so you will each get a copy of all the material that we have today. And also there will be a recording of the webinar that will be posted on YouTube, so you can go back and watch it or share it with colleagues. So all of that will be available to you as well. And then I would also like to invite you, if you need continuing education credits for today's webinar, we have not submitted the webinar for pre-approval to any state agency. However, we are happy to give you a certificate from today's webinar of attendance and any other documentation you need, and you can self-report the webinar today in states where they will accept webinars for your CEU licenses. So there'll be an opportunity at the end of the hour for you to indicate whether or not you need a certificate from us. So I think that pretty much handles the logistical end. As with most webinars, we're keeping the audience on mute. So please don't yell at me or try to wave your hands. I can't see you or hear you. Just use the question box if there's anything you need to ask. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Water Finance Assistance before we get started. So we are a new training and technical assistance entity that has just been formed in the last couple of months. And our goal is really to help water systems, as I'm sure all of our goals are, is to help water systems have safe and reliable drinking water today and into the future. And the way that we're going to do that is through improving finance and management using data analysis. And that really plays in well to what we'll be talking about today on the webinar, is how to use information, mostly information that you as a water system have at your fingertips already, and how you can use that to understand your system better, to make good policy decisions, and to help you be in the best position to provide safe and reliable water into the future. So we're a really big believer in that first off, what you do as a water system, or for those of you who regulate or work with water systems listening in today, it's hugely important. It's hugely important for public health. I'm very grateful for the efforts that you put in, so thank you. And we want to be here to help you do what you do as well as possible and have the resources that you need, because realistically, we need to be able to give people in the future the best water system that they can have and leave it in good shape for future generations. So that's a little bit about us. I'm the Director of Water Finance Assistance, as I mentioned. Some of you may know me from my previous work with the Environmental Finance Center Network. I worked at the UNC Environmental Finance Center for 12 years prior to founding this new venture. And so I've worked with some of you in that capacity. And if we haven't met before, very nice to meet all of you, and thank you for joining us today. So that's a little bit about us. I do want to have an opportunity to get to know the folks on the line a little bit better. So I'm going to launch a quick poll here for you. Just let us know, what type of entity do you represent? So go ahead and vote. If you are a water system serving 10,000 or fewer people, please mark the first box. If you're a water system serving more than 10,000 people, the second. If you're from a state or federal program, the third. If you're a TA provider, the fourth. Or if you're from the consulting community, go ahead and pick the last option. All right, we will go ahead and close the poll, and let's take a look at those results here. So we have a good number of folks here, about 40% are from state or federal programs, so glad to have all of you here. about 47% from water systems of various sizes, and then TA providers and consultants make up the rest. And we're just really delighted that all of you are here because all of us have a role to play in showing the success and ensuring the success of drinking water systems. And this is just a map showing where we have attendees from today. Very grateful to see such a wide geographic disbursement. We have about 45 states and territories represented. So again, thank you so much for being here. So what I want to do is start with the premise of what we're going to be looking at today, and then we'll dive into the specifics from there. So water systems obviously have an important public health function. They should be well-run business entities, which we'll be talking about certainly today. But I really want to focus in on the idea of drinking water as a public service. And I think whether you are a municipal water system or a district or a mobile home park or a homeowner association or even a non-community system like an office building, a hospital, a school, etc., you have a responsibility of ensuring that the people who rely on you for drinking water get safe drinking water. And so we start with that premise. Drinking water is a vital public service. It needs to be available and accessible to all customers today and into the future. And also having plentiful, reliable water helps to drive the local economy. And I think that's another piece of what we're going to be looking at today and what we do as part of our work here at Water Finance Assistance is that tie between the water system and serving the broader community. And so in order to best serve the community, all water systems should set priorities. In fact, for everybody listening in, I'm sure you have a lot of priorities for your water system. And we're going to touch on 4 today that I think are very common and ones that I've often heard in my work with water systems over the last decade or so. And so I picked these 4 because I think they're pretty prominent, but obviously it's up to you as a water system to decide what your priority is. And then from there, how to best measure whether you're doing a good job meeting it. So the objective of the webinar, we'll start off with identifying some common water system priorities and how those priorities relate to serving the community better. And then we'll move on to demonstrate one metric of many that you can calculate for each of those 4 priority areas that I've narrowed in on for today's presentation. So first off, as I mentioned, drinking water has this hugely important role in protecting public health. So those people who work in drinking water have as much to do with protecting public health, frankly, as doctors and nurses do. And so we want to make sure that you are in the best position to do that. And in order to do that, in order to protect public health and to take raw water and turn it into something that is consumable, something that is delivered on demand to customers that meets the level of service that our customers expect of us, we need a couple of the things that you see in this picture. The first is we need infrastructure. We need treatment capacity, we need pipes, we need pumps and motors, and we also need skilled staff, like the water operator that we see in front of us here. And those skilled staff will know how to run the system best in order to deliver that water to our customers. So we need appropriate amounts of revenue in order to do all of this. So in order to protect public health and maintain infrastructure, we need an appropriate amount of revenue. So that's the first priority that we're going to look at today. Now, the second priority that we're going to look at has to deal with economic development. So obviously, we could not have a community without having a good drinking water supply. We would not be able to have people live there. We would not be able to have business locate there. We would not be able to have agriculture. We need to have a really reliable supply of drinking water that when people turn on the tap, it's there and they don't have to think about it, and that it meets the needs of our customers. And in particular, I think for a lot of communities, we want to think about how the drinking water system can support and promote and sustain economic development within the community. So what we mean here is not just to be able to maintain the number of households and businesses, commercial entities, institutions, et cetera, that are in our communities, but also allow for more to come in if our water supply allows for that and if our community desires that. So that is our second priority that we're going to look at today. Okay, the third is that all water systems have a certain amount of supply available to them. And depending on the number of customers you have, the types of customers you have, where in the country you are, and what kind of climate you have, whether you're prone to drought or not, we want to make sure that that amount of supply we have is most efficiently getting to our customers. And so for some of you, that's going to mean having to promote conservation. We're going to actually need our customers to use a little bit less of our water product because supply is constrained, treatment capacity is constrained, other factors. But for others of you, you may actually want your customers to use more of your product. You want more water to go out the door because that would bring in more revenue, help the system run better, give you the money that you need for infrastructure. So we're going to take a look at this priority of improving the efficiency of water use by customers. And then finally, the last priority that often comes up is ensuring that everybody within our community has access to water as needed. And so affordability is a big issue. It's certainly a very hot topic these days in the water field. But I find it's also, I don't know, a little bit, I don't want to say controversial per se, because I think a lot of people feel like water should be affordable for those who need it. But when I've done workshops and webinars in the past on affordability, you immediately start to get some heads butting, some arguments about what constitutes affordability, what percentage, and then how do we distinguish between people who have real need or people who are just kind of gaming the system? You know, how do we decide, whether somebody who has a cell phone or cable or a car or drinks alcohol or smokes cigarettes, whether, they should be eligible for affordability programs. So a really important topic, but one I feel like you start to get some head butting. So I'm going to actually reframe this question a little bit differently, away from affordability to something that I think we can all agree on, which is how to maximize the number of customers paying their bills. So one measure as to whether or not our water is affordable is if people are actually affording our water. Now, I don't want to completely sidestep the question of affordability because there will be some people paying that bill who are really struggling and could use some help. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the hour. But we're going to really hone in on trying to get the maximum number of our customers to pay their bill regularly. So these are the 4 priority areas we're going to cover on the webinar today. And as I said, we're going to go into each one and talk about one metric, hopefully an easy metric that you can do to see how you're doing in that priority area. And hopefully all of you can go home and after the webinar is over and actually institute some of this material. Okay, so we're going to start with number 1, priority number 1, having an appropriate amount of revenue to protect public health and maintain infrastructure. So when we talk about appropriate revenue here, there's a couple of things that we have in mind. The first is that we need money for the day-to-day expenses of running the water system, your operational expenses. Now, this is going to include the salaries and benefits you pay to your employees. It will include the taxes you have to pay, your insurance costs, your lab testing fees, any water purchases you make, the utilities you pay, all of your day-to-day expenses of running the water system. I think this is a pretty clear one for most water systems. They understand if they don't have this, it's going to be really hard to run the system well. But appropriate revenue is not just about today, it's also about the future. So we also want to take a look at the refurbishment and rehabilitation and replacement of infrastructure. So day-to-day expenses may include a little bit of kind of minor repairs, but when we're really talking about major rehabilitation and replacement of infrastructure, we're talking about capital costs here. And you need to have an appropriate amount of revenue to take the infrastructure in the ground now as it wears out and replace it with something newer that will function better. In addition, if your system is in a growing area, growing community, you may need new infrastructure, new pipe, new towers, new treatment, new wells that are not there currently. And so we need to have money to do that. And if you've borrowed money for any of these purposes, you also need money to cover your debt service. So again, capital infrastructure can be paid as you go. You can save up and build up your reserves to pay later. You could get a grant if you're very fortunate to help cover the cost, or you may borrow money to pay off that infrastructure over time. But in any case, when we talk about appropriate revenue, we're really talking about this entire gamut of infrastructure and funding needs. So it's not just about today, it's about the future as well. So the metric that I want to choose for having an appropriate amount of revenue is operating ratio. And this may be one that a lot of you are familiar with. A lot of groups talk about this. Certainly in my time working with the Environmental Finance Center and doing a lot of trainings and webinars with them, if any of you have attended those, you've probably heard me talk about operating ratio before. But basically what we're talking about here very simply is your annual operating revenue as a percentage of your annual operating expenses. So pretty straightforward formula. You take your annual operating revenue, you divide it by your annual operating expenses. That's all we have to do. So like I said, very straightforward. Now, in order to calculate this metric, this is the information you're going to need. You're going to need the cost of, or your annual operating revenues, excuse me. So this is going to be money coming from the rates that you charge, from any fees that you have, any penalties that you levy against customers, any other kind of miscellaneous charges. If you have a cell phone receiver on your water tank, sell ad space on your water tank, whatever the case is, this is your operating revenue that's coming in throughout the course of a single year. That's the time frame we want to look at. Now, we also need to look at your annual operating expenses. So that's everything that I mentioned earlier: salaries, benefits, your overhead, your utilities, insurance costs, regulatory fees, etc. So this is the day-to-day cost of running the water system. So this is just day-to-day cost. We're not including capital in that annual operating expenses. But one way to put capital in is to also include your annual depreciation on your capital assets. So I could, and in fact have done, an hour-long webinar just on depreciation, but the 30-second version, I think most of you are familiar with this concept, is that as things get older, they lose value. And so say you buy an asset that costs $10,000, it has an expected useful life of 10 years. The way depreciation would work, at least what they call straight line depreciation, is that every year you can book $1,000 of expense of lost value of that asset. So at the end of 10 years, you will have depreciated $10,000, the purchase price. And if you include this in the operating ratio, it'll give you a sense of whether or not your system is recovering at least some money that can be put towards capital repairs, capital replacement, and rehabilitation. Now, depreciation is not a perfect measure, especially if your accountant is the one measuring it. It doesn't necessarily reflect how assets are doing in the ground. And also keep in mind, if that 10-year expected useful life asset has now been in the ground for 12 years, its annual depreciation cost is zero because you've gotten a longer useful life out of it. So you may not be capturing that in your number, but it's better than nothing. I'll put it that way. So it's a good number to include as you're taking a look overall at your costs. So where to find this information? For those of you, especially those of you calling in today from governmental water systems who do audited financial statements, especially those that follow the GASB rules, the Government Accounting Standards Board rules, those audited financial statements will have all of the information that you need in order to calculate the operating ratio. So I have up on the screen for you here, this is an actual page from a water systems annual financial statements. I pulled this off the web, and you can see right here, here is your operating revenue. It's about $47 million for this particular water system. And then here are your expenses, about $39 million, depreciation very helpfully already included in that number. So if you have these audited financial statements, you have all the information you need to do the operating ratio. If you don't sweat it. You can still look at your annual budget actuals, your internal financials, expense reports. The information you have will be within your water system. It's just going to take you a little bit longer to put that information together. So the target for this particular ratio is obviously you want the expenses to be higher than the revenues. I think that's pretty obvious, right? We want to have, the opposite of that. Revenues higher than expenses is obviously what we want to have. And ideally, you want that ratio to be 1.2 or higher. Now, the reason it's 1.2 or higher, so if your revenues are exactly the same as your expenses, then that means you have no wiggle room. You've brought in exactly the right amount of money to cover your annual costs. But of course, we know the weather, the climate, the number of customers moving in and out of a community, there can be small changes in that revenue or in expenses year in and year out. So having a little bit of a cushion is good. And then one of the things that was not included in the operating ratio is debt service. So if you owe money to a lender, whether that's a bond or a government program or a bank, you're going to want a little bit of extra money to cover that as well. So that example financial statement I showed you earlier, let's actually pull the numbers off of that and do the calculation. So the annual operating revenue is, as I said, about $46.9 million in that year. The expenses worked out to be about $39 million for that particular water system for the year. And if you do the math, this calculation comes out to 1.2. So what that means is that in the year that we are looking at here, this water system brought in 120% of its expenses. So it brought in enough to cover the day-to-day costs, enough to cover the depreciation on their capital assets, and a little bit extra as padding. So this is a pretty good number. I think if you're a water system and you're getting this number, you should be happy. If you get a lower number, if you get something that's more closer to 1 or even below 1, that's when we want to take a look at, can we cut down on your cost side or can we increase your revenues? So as I said, that is just one metric for appropriate revenue. There are several others that you could consider. Just for example, a debt service coverage ratio. So if you have debt service, you can take a look at how much money you have to pay off that debt service once you pay your day-to-day expenses. You could take a look at your cash flow. So do you have enough money throughout the year to cover the current bills that you have? You can look at changes in operating expenses over time or in operating revenue over time, or even in these financial indicators over time is a good metric to have. And then also, if you put together an asset management plan or a capital improvement plan, you can really look at whether or not, more specifically than depreciation, you have the money you need for capital investment. So that's another metric to consider. So as I said, we're just going to do one for each of these, but beyond these 4 or 5 I have on the screen are probably a dozen or 2 dozen more that we could take a look at. Okay, so that's appropriate revenue. We're going to go on to the second priority now, which is having an adequate water supply capacity infrastructure to promote and sustain economic development. Now, in order to take a look at this priority, I've had conversations not just with a number of water systems, but also with groups whose job it is to help bring business to communities. So I've met with Chamber of Commerce groups, with economic development authorities, and had conversations to say, well, what is it that you really need out of a water system in order for a business to locate to where you are? And so I think what it really comes down to is, if you're talking about a big residential development, business coming in, industry coming in, or that are considering locating to your community, they really care about the quantity of water. How much water can you supply these folks today? And I think the today part is important because really any community, given enough lead time, say a year, would be able to up their capacity for water, get additional permits, build new infrastructure to be able to serve a new industrial customer coming in, or a large residential development, whatever the case may be. But are you prepared today to take on a bigger customer? Now, yes, business and industry, they care a little bit about price. Probably not a huge deal unless there are significantly huge water customers and your rates are much higher than, say, neighboring areas. They're going to care really about the water quantity, about the available infrastructure, the pressure you can provide, whether there's good investment in the infrastructure itself. That's really what they're going to hone in on. And then I think for those business and industries where water is a part of their final product produced, they're going to also care a good bit about the water quality. So if you're talking about, a large water using industry where the water quality is not a part of the final product, say like a pulp and paper mill or a textile mill, they're going to care about that quantity of water, the quality, the infrastructure, all of that. But if you're talking about, say, a brewery that is making beer, where water is part of the final product going out the door, they're going to care about that water quality as well. So just something to keep in mind. Now, your water supply has a couple of constraints, and these constraints are going to limit how much water you would be able to supply today. So the first is that most of you probably have some type of withdrawal permit, whether it's for surface water or well water. Again, this will vary state to state, so you have to kind of be cognizant of the rules in your particular part of the country. But you may have some type of permit limit on how much water you can take out of the ground. And then in other parts of the country, you may also have water rights on top of that. So there's a withdrawal permit, and then separately, there's this idea of water rights that you have to pay for that are a limiting factor. Here in the East, I'm based in North Carolina. That's not so much of an issue, but in the central and western part of the country, those of you listening in from there, you know it's quite a big issue. You're also going to have a limit of how much water your system can treat, so your treatment capacity, how much it can pump, so your pumping capacity, and how much it can store. And those are going to be just very practical constraints on how much additional water you can supply. There may be drought conditions in your area. That's something that you'll want to keep in mind, or at least to consider as you're looking at these numbers. And then finally, perhaps whatever you need for fire flow. Some of you need a certain amount of water or pressure for fire flow that goes beyond what your customer usage is. So these are all of the constraints you have on your supply. And what we need to do is to figure out how to capture all of that information and how to massage it. And one tool that is available to you that I particularly like is the state of Maryland has a capacity management worksheet and guidance document that looks at water supply. So this is something the state developed in response to drought. So it was kind of drought driven, and it's required of systems of a certain size in Maryland that meet certain criteria. But the actual worksheet and the guidance document and how to go about doing it, I think is really, really helpful. And it's a free tool available. That worksheet is an Excel document that you can download. So if you don't really know where to start with this, I highly recommend going to the Maryland tool. Now, in order to do that Maryland tool in full, you're going to have to collect a lot of data. So that's not going to be a simple lift. You know, what we did for the operating ratio is really straightforward, that you're just going to grab information off of your financial statement. This is going to be a little bit more data gathering, but you have all the data on hand that you need. And so what you want to do is look at your available supply. This is the metric on your highest day of use. So that's going to be taking your available supply minus your peak daily usage, and then also minus any expected demand from new development. So if you have approved new development, it hasn't gone in the ground yet, or it's in the process of being built, we want to factor that in here, obviously, because for future development, that amount of water is not going to be available. So in order to calculate this metric, you're going to need the maximum daily demand from at least the past year, if not a longer period of time, the capacity of any approved new development, as we mentioned, and then all of those other numbers, your permitted capacity, storage capacity, pumping capacity, et cetera. You're going to need a lot of engineering data here. Hopefully you have that for your system, or you can gather it, because really where you're going to find this information is going to be out of your water system operations data. So the data that you're capturing on your water system day in and day out of how it's running, and that's going to be where you're going to find a lot of this information, as well as your permit, your water rights agreements, any kind of water purchase agreement. So if you're a purchase system, either in part or in whole, that would be another constraint on supply. And ideally, you're going to want to come up with a table that looks something like this, where we're going to look at some of these potential constraints. So the withdrawal permit limit, the water source capacity, the treatment capacity, et cetera, and then the maximum daily amount of treated water. And for the group at the top, what we're going to look for is the smallest number. So for this particular system from Maryland, that is 760,000 gallons per day. That's the permit that they have from the state. That's their withdrawal limit, 760,000 gallons a day. And then we want to look at the maximum daily amount of water that was treated in the last year. And treated is really important here, not sold. Because if you have leaking pipes or non-revenue water in some ways, we want to make sure your supply is going to be constrained by what's coming out of the treatment plant, not what's ending up being paid for by customers. So now your target on this, unlike the operating ratio, is it really depends. You may have a very specific potential customer in mind. So, you may want to bring a t-shirt factory to town. They need X amount of gallons per day, and you want to see if you have that level, at least keeping in mind to have a little bit on reserve. Or you may want to just understand what level of additional water use you can support today given your current capacity constraints. So let's take a look at this formula again, plugging in some of those numbers that we saw. So the first for the available supply, again, 760,000 gallons per day was the constraint. The peak daily usage was 677,000 gallons per day. And for this particular community, they had not green-lighted any new development. So that actually comes out to be 0. And the total of all of this is 83,000 gallons per day. That is the available supply capacity today. So if they had a large industrial customer wanting to come that needed up to that amount, or maybe with a little bit of a buffer, they would be able to accommodate them today, at least in terms of supply capacity. Now, you might want to say, okay, I don't have a very specific person in mind, but I want to see, well, what could we bring in? How do we kind of break this down to a more understandable number? So one of the things we could do is look at the equivalent of a dwelling unit in terms of that capacity. So again, we'll take the 83,000 gallons per day available. Let's actually just take 90% of that, because again, we want to have a little bit of a cushion here. We don't want to go right up to the limit. So that'll turn out to be 74,700 gallons per day. And then in your water system, you need to figure out how much each dwelling unit uses on average and kind of come up with a number. The Maryland program recommends 250 gallons per day. So that's assuming a household size of 2.5 and 100 gallons per day per person. So we'll use that number for this calculation. And what it turns out to be is 299 equivalent domestic units. So that's another way of looking at this number. So this particular community, if they wanted to, could add a housing development of about 300 units under its current supply restrictions, or it could add an industrial or commercial customer that is an equivalent amount to that. Now, obviously, again, just one metric under economic development that we could consider. We could also take a look at the water pressure available at different lots. That may be a big issue for some of your potential industrial or agricultural customers. We could take a look, this is really interesting, at the revenue per square foot or per acre based on the type of development. And why I think this is interesting for some communities, especially in the eastern half of the country, where your physical town is really built out. You don't have land to annex. You don't have a lot of open lots for new development. You may want to maximize the amount of revenue you're getting in on your available remaining lots. And so you might take a look to see, well, would it be better in this large tract of land to put a housing development, or to put small commercial in, or to put an industrial plant in, and try to target your economic development based on that future income. And then you also want to take a look at the trends of business and industry in your community. So you can go to the US Census and find the business census and take a look at what's going on, I think down to the county level in your area in terms of business and industry coming and going. And then you can also take a look, there is this North American Industry Classification System, or a NAICS code, that is assigned to different types of businesses. And certain ones of those codes tend to be higher water users than others. So you could see, are you getting more of those codes that are potentially going to be higher water users in your area, or are you using more? So that's another metric to consider. Okay, so we've looked at having appropriate amounts of revenue. We've looked at economic development. Third metric we'll look at is improving the efficiency of water use by your customers. Now, before we get to the customer use, I referenced this just a second ago, but I want to mention it again. You should really be looking, and one of the most important things you can do in this type of analysis is looking at your non-revenue water. And I think the gold standard that most of us use for this is the AWWA methodology. So to look at how much water are you treating versus how much are customers paying for, and why is there a difference, and is it from leaks? Is it authorized unbilled use? Is it bad metering? Are you giving water away for free? Whatever the case is, this is a really important thing. There are tons of great webinars on this, so I'm not going to talk about it. But before you really care about how your customers are ultimately using water, I think you want to make sure that the efficiency is good on your end first. So quick mention for that. But when we're really talking about efficient customer use, essentially your water supply, treatment capacity, storage capacity, permit allowance is limited, as we were just talking about, and you may want to encourage conservation. There may be a drought going on or state regulations that have been put into place due to a drought that you need to encourage your customers to use less water. On the flip side, you may have more water than you know what to do with, and you may want to encourage your customers to use more water because it would be better for you if you could actually sell more of the water that you have rather than less of the water that you have. These are both good goals, and it depends on your community which one you have, but the metric that we're going to look at works in both cases. And so what we're going to look at really here is discretionary water. So we all need a certain amount of water to live on, right? We know that without water, we would die rather quickly. And beyond that minimum amount necessary to sustain life, really there's a certain amount more that we want to live comfortably, where we can take a nice shower, cook a nice meal at home, have water to drink, you know, all of those kinds of modern conveniences that we take for granted. So to live and live comfortably. But then beyond that, there was a certain amount of water use, especially at the residential level, that could be considered discretionary. So if you do a lot of outdoor irrigation, if you have a swimming pool or a hot tub or some type of water feature in your yard, that's water that you're using out of the public water supply, but it's not necessary to sustain life or to even live comfortably. So we want to take a look at what that might be. And then I also include in discretionary water leaking pipes. So this is leaking pipes on the customer side of the meter. So if they have a toilet that runs nonstop, if they have a pipe leaking coming out of the meter box in the front yard, dripping faucet, whatever the case is, that leaking water device or pipe is not using water very efficiently. It's using it in a kind of discretionary way. So the metric that we want to look at here is the percentage of customers where their usage in one of your billing cycles over the course of a year is at least twice their minimum billing cycle usage. Now, I picked twice. You could say 2.5, you could say 1.5, you could say 3. It's kind of up to you to come up with the number. But what we're essentially talking about is customers that have at least one relatively high usage compared to the total number of customers in the system. And the reason that we feel like this is getting at discretionary water use is that we assume if somebody is in that home or business over the course of the year and they're there consistently and they're using water consistently, if they have a billing cycle where the usage is really high compared to other billing cycles, it's probably an indication that they're doing something like outdoor irrigation or filling up a pool or whatever the case may be. So in order to calculate this metric, there's a couple things you're going to need. The first is your customer usage records for at least a year broken out by billing period. It might be more ideal to have multiple years here. And you're going to need a good spreadsheet because there's going to be a lot of number crunching that's going to have to go on here. And you'll find all the information that you need for this in your billing software or your customer records. If you contract out the billing to a third party, talk to them about getting these data points in for you. Shouldn't be a problem to get what you need. And ideally, we want to set up a spreadsheet that looks like this, where you have all the customers listed as each one a row, all of their billing periods, and then some math on the side. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this so you can get a little bit better look at what we're talking about here. So we're going to start with that customer number and starting in January with their usage, and then that's going to go all the way across to December of their usage. From there, we write some formulas to look at the minimum non-zero month. 0 months will mess up your calculation, so look at the non-zero months and then the maximum month. And then just very simply, what's the ratio of the maximum to the minimum non-zero, and is it above whatever your target is? In my case, again, it was 2. So not a hard amount of math to do. It's probably going to be a lot harder to get this information pulled together neatly. Now again here, your target depends. If you want to promote conservation, you want this number to be low. You want the percentage of people who have that higher use billing period to be low, But if you want to promote water consumption, you actually want this number to be high. So again, depending on what your goals are, it's going to depend on what you want the number to be, but the calculation is the same either way. So in that example community, a place I worked with some years ago, the number of customers with relatively high usage over the course of a year was 417. That was out of a customer base of 611. And so that gave us 68% of their customers had what I would guess to be discretionary water use. Now, again, if they wanted to promote conservation, 68% is a little bit on the high side. They would probably want to look at some billing practices or some non-billing practices to get that number down. But if they wanted to promote water use, they would probably be very happy to see that number. Maybe you want to see it get a little bit higher. So a couple of quick notes here. I worked with a community in New Jersey a few years ago that was tricky when it came to calculating this number for a couple of reasons. One is, I find this number is a lot easier to do if you have monthly billing, because if you have quarterly billing, which was the case with this community, you can go from winter to spring or spring to summer within the span of that quarter, and so the water use can vary. It's a little bit more regular if you do monthly billing. If you don't, not a problem. You can still do the math, but it's helpful. The other thing about this community is that they had two groups of residents that were not there year-round. They had college students. There was a university in town who were basically there during the academic year, but gone during the breaks and during the summer. And then they had a healthy population of snowbirds. So this was a community in the Northeast where some of their retirees during the winter would go to Florida or Arizona or someplace warmer for 2 to 4 months and then come back. And again, because of the quarterly billing, sometimes that quarter would capture some of that time period, but not all of it. So you've got to know your customer base when you're calculating this number to really make sure that it makes sense. Particular example community we had, I think the residents there are pretty much there year-round, so I feel pretty confident in this number. Now, real quick, a couple of other metrics to consider on this set of ratios, efficient customer use. I mentioned non-revenue water. Please, please, please do this. If you are not doing it for your water system, look up the great tools and resources available to you. Attend some of the good workshops out there. It's really an important measurement to have. The percent of billing periods that are relatively high usage. So I'm looking at just in this metric, the percent of customers, but you might want to look at the percent of billing periods. You might want to look at how much that discretionary use is. You might want to get down to really what's being consumed outside. Maybe you meter outside water use separately. Maybe you're doing that already, or you consider adding a second meter to homes to be able to calculate that. And then also just the amount of water likely lost to customer side leaks. And I think that's where you look for one billing cycle that is way out of whack from the other 11 in a year, that it's probably not really discretionary use, it's a leak. And, that leak may have gotten fixed relatively quickly. You might want to get a good sense of this. And if you have a lot of them, that might be something that you could help, especially if you have a lot of renters where the renter is paying the water bill, but the landlord owns the home. There's not a lot of incentive for that landlord to fix leaks. So that might be a group that you want to target to do some work with to get that number down if that's really what you're looking for. Okay. On to the last priority area, maximizing the number of customers who pay their bills regularly. So when we're looking at maximizing bill payments, what we want to do is limit the number of customers who aren't paying you for whatever reason that is. We want to limit the number of customers who are not paying their bills each billing period. And then we want to increase your cash flow. So, when you get a large number of customers who aren't paying, you get a lot of arrears. We don't want those arrearages. We want to have that kind of cash flow, especially during the times of year when the amount of revenue is a little bit lower, say for many of you during the winter or during dry season, depending on where you are in the country. We want to make sure you have that good cash flow, so we want to maximize the number of people paying bills. Now, I talked to some like USDA lending programs, some credit rating agencies, and they all reiterated that while the arrearage rate is not particularly going to ding you in terms of their scoring, or at least most of the people going to say Moody's or S&P for bond ratings usually have this number in order. Theoretically, it could if it's high enough. And I think that, though, it will impact your ability to be able to repay debt and pay for those needed capital improvements, especially if you're not getting all the money in that you could on a regular basis. So we're going to look our metric here at the habitual non-payers. So we know most customers pay their bills regularly and on time. Most customers are really good about this. Some customers occasionally miss a bill payment. Might be for a legitimate reason. They just had a really rough month. They lost their job. They had a high medical bill, whatever it could be. Might be for a bad reason. They don't feel like paying their bill. Or it might be for a dumb reason. Dumb reason like what I did once when before my utility had an auto pay system. You had to send in a check every month. And my wife and I went on vacation, and I completely forgot to pay the bill before we left. We were gone a couple of weeks, and the water got shut off while we were gone, which was most unfortunate to the kind person house sitting for us. So we had to, call the utility and get that straightened out. But even good customers, every once in a while, for a dumb reason, forget to pay their bill. But this last group is that there's a few customers, a handful of customers who habitually do not pay their bills in part or in whole. And these people are a giant suck on your time and energy. These people, every month or every billing period, they're getting, a bill, maybe a second bill, a reminder phone call, a door hanger. You're going out to shut them off. They come in and pay. You turn them back on again. 2 months later, they're right back to the same problem. Every water system I have talked to in the last month as I've been putting together this webinar has had stories about these customers. The system I work with in New Jersey told me that there's probably 5 to 10 of them in a system of 15,000 people served, but those 5 to 10 take such a hugely disproportionate amount of the water administrator's time that they really are a drain on the overall finance and management of the water system. So this is the group that we want to eliminate. So we want to take a look at the percentage of accounts that are in arrears that come from customers who habitually have issues paying their bills on time. So that's the number of habitual non-payers divided by your total number of customers. That's the metric that we're going to look at. Now, in order to calculate this, you're going to need, again, customer billing records for at least a year broken out by billing period. And those customer records are going to have to show who is paying and who is not paying. That's going to be an important part of this. And again, a good spreadsheet is going to be helpful. And where you're going to find this, again, will be from your billing software or your customer records or whoever handles this on behalf of your water system. You can ask for this information. And this is just an example from a community I've worked with. They sent me a copy of this, and where you can see sort of those numbers floating in the middle there are customers who have arrearages because they have interest or penalty charges. And so your target here is you want the number to be as low as possible. These customers are never good for your water system. You don't want them in your water system for any reason, really. And if the number seems high, so if you calculate this and the number is relatively low, I think you're in good shape. But if the number seems high, you can work to get it lower over time. And that may be as simple as just making sure you're really enforcing your payment regulations, that, if you're threatening to shut somebody off, you actually shut them off if they don't come up with payment. One of the worst things that you can do as a water system, I think, is to say to somebody that you'll shut them off for non-payment and then don't follow through. So you really want to make sure you're enforcing that policy consistently. But I do want to keep in mind that if you've had a customer who has come in and said, hey, I'm sorry, I'm behind, I need to set up a payment plan, and you've done that for them, and they are actually making those payments, they're going to be captured in this number unless you have a way to weed them out, because it's going to show, your billing software is going to show that they have an arrearage. So that's just something to keep in mind, that this number is going to unfortunately maybe capture some people trying to do the right thing. So for that particular system that I was mentioning, I had to figure out how to actually define a habitual non-payer. And the way that I did that is I had a year of billing data, and I took a look at the current month of who owed money, and then I looked 6 months back at who owed money beyond their regular bill that month. And then I looked a year back at who owed money beyond their regular bill. And I took a look for the number of accounts that showed up a year ago, 6 months ago, and today. Now, that's not a perfect system because maybe they would have come and gone, but it seems to me that if they're showing up on all three of those lists, and really, if you want to do this better, do it every month. but I just chose 3 months out of a year to do it, you're going to look for the people who are consistently showing up on the non-payment list. And for this particular water system, that was 28 customers out of a customer base of 241 people. So that came up to a number of about 12%. Now, that number is a little bit on the high side in my estimation, but I will say, and this is important, this particular water system was not good about enforcing its collection policies for a while. They have turned the corner in the last year. So you'll actually see the number of people with arrears has been consistently going down over the last year. That's great. A year ago, the number was maybe 60. It's now 40. That's terrific. But there is this set of habitual non-payers that they're still struggling to capture. And again, some of those 28 people likely have set up a payment plan and they are repaying their bills regularly. So ideally, you'd want to have a list of those, go in and subtract them out of this number. So it's probably a little bit less than this. But again, those people were habitually not paying their bill, and now they're setting up a way to kind of get caught up. So that's the last metric. Now, a couple of other metrics to consider here. The amount of arrears compared to the total amount of revenue. Obviously, we're just looking at customers, but if those 28 customers are all Granny, who uses 1,500 gallons a month, but all of your hotels and dry cleaners and car washes in town are paying regularly, from a revenue standpoint, having a 12% of your customers being habitually late may not actually be that much of a problem. We're just looking here at the number of customers, not at the total amount owed. And your audited financial statements may actually have this number, which would be great if it does. Not all of them do, but if you can find it in the notes or ask your auditor to calculate it, it will help you get this metric as well. You could look at the number of customers on social safety net programs in the area, so the number that are on Social Security, food stamps, cash public assistance, etc., or who meet certain demographic triggers that are likely going to show you that they may have trouble paying their water bills. The environmental finance centers have a really great free tool that you can use on affordability, that this is the approach that they use as part of that, grabbing that money from the census. And then a couple of metrics that have been thought up by Manny Teodoro from Texas A&M, who a number of you may know Manny, a real good thinker in this area around affordability and bill payments. So one is looking at affordability of water at the 20th percentile of household income in your community. And then the other is looking at the water bill in terms of the hours of minimum wage labor required to pay it in your particular area, which is another really interesting way of taking a look at this. So again, lots and lots of good metrics. I've given you 4 to think about for 4 priorities, but there are many more priorities out there. And there are many more metrics for each of the 4 that we've talked about that we could take a look at. So this is really meant to be an overview today, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to delve a little bit more deeply into this. So I saw a couple questions have come in as I've been talking. If you have others, please go ahead and submit them through the question box. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to do a couple of quick polls here for you. So the first is to help me with in terms of our content. Did you learn something today that you can use in your work? So either answer yes or no for me, please. I'll give you a couple seconds to respond to that poll. All right, looks like we have everybody in, so I'm going to go ahead and close that off now. And then another poll question I will put up here is, are you interested in learning more about ways that you can work with me at Water Finance Assistance on measuring water system priorities? And that can either be, if you're a water system, please say yes. If you're from a state or federal program and you want to talk about how we could partner together to do this for the systems in your area, please say yes. And for those of you who say yes, I will follow up with you in the next couple days and we'll have a chat and see what we could do here. I will just give you another couple seconds to respond to that poll. we will go ahead and close that here. Another question to put up, as I mentioned earlier, if you need a certificate from today's webinar for CEU purposes, just please go ahead and click yes or no here. And if you click yes, I will send you in the next week or so a certificate. And again, if you need any more information from me, an agenda, my bio, anything like that, just please don't hesitate to email out to me, and I'll be happy to take care of that for you. All right, give me another second on that one. And we will go ahead and close that. And if you answered no or didn't get a chance to answer and then realized later that you need it, please go ahead and just email me. My contact information will be at the end. And then the last question before we get to your questions is that today's webinar was really an overview of these 4 priority areas. But in the future, if we're able to get some good funding, what I'd like to do is to dive in and spend the entire hour talking about just one of those priority areas for that entire amount of time and show you several different metrics. So go ahead and vote for me on which one you are most interested in hearing about next, and that's something we will take into consideration as we're thinking about the next webinar that we put together for you. And again, my hope is that we'll eventually cover all of these areas in more depth. Plus, if you have other ideas of priority areas, just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to take a look at those and we'll see what we can do. All right, I will give you just a second on this one. And we'll go ahead and close that. And just in case anybody's interested, I'm going to go ahead and share these results because it was pretty even split actually between the 4, but it looks like appropriate revenue has a little bit of a lead. So that's something we'll take a look at for the future, as well as some good support for the others. So like I said, I hope we'll be able to do all of them at some point, but wanted to see what the interest might be for our very next one. So I'll get to your questions in just a second, but the best way to keep up with everything going on at Water Finance Assistance is our website, waterfinanceassistance.com. You see a screenshot of it here. That's where I'll be posting the slide deck and a recording of today's webinar. And here's my contact information. Email is probably the best way to reach me, but that's my cell phone as well. I am on Twitter. So if you are on Twitter as well, please follow me at H2O Finance, and then our website again is listed there. So if you haven't submitted a question, please go ahead and do so. And I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the questions that we have had come in so far, and we'll go ahead and answer those. All right, so had a question from Denise Schmidt from Wisconsin, who I've done a lot of great work with about, it seems like a water utility should be careful in promoting water use as it could work against having available supply for economic development purposes. Should a utility assign weights to each of these metrics to help balance competing objectives against each other? Really, really great question. So yes, I mean, obviously all of these 4 metrics work together to some extent, and they work against each other to some extent as well, right? So having increasing bill payment may mean, well, if your bill was a little bit lower, it would be easier for that. That could cut into your appropriate revenue. And you do want to balance, if you want to promote your current customer base to use more, that's one objective, but you may also want to, rather than do that, save that extra capacity and try to go out and get another large customer to come in instead. So really great question, and yes, there has to be some balance. So that's one question that came through. Another kind of thought around the same idea, about the idea of utilities encouraging high water usage. And I just want to reiterate here, what we're really talking about here is, again, not necessarily promoting a lot of waste, but we want to say that if you have a lot of capacity available and your customers may want to use more, all you may want to actually do in that particular circumstance is not promote conservation, but rather just kind of let customers use water as they have it. And a couple of questions came in. Can you get a copy of the presentation? Again, as I mentioned, yes, I will happy to make a PDF of the slide deck available. So we have another minute or two if anybody else has a question to come in. But otherwise, I would like to just thank you all for your time and attention today. It's great that you can take a little bit of time out of your busy schedule to listen in, and hope it's been a valuable set of information for you. And I'm really excited about the work that we're doing under this new venture, because I think at the end of the day, what I really believe is that all water systems will be better off if they can develop policy based on data analysis. So based on something more objective than just your gut, and looking at all of these different areas. So that's something that we really want to focus on in terms of the work we do at Water Finance Assistance. And I think as the examples that I showed today and many others show, you are sitting on all of the data that you need right now to do these calculations. What you need is some know-how of how to do them, or maybe some time to put towards it. A lot of you know how to make the calculations, but don't necessarily have a lot of extra time. And so that's something that we can help you with, is to look at what the right calculations are given your priorities, where to find that data, and then what the numbers mean and how to go forward from there. So with that, I will say thank you so much again for listening in today. We'll close the webinar. And again, if you have any questions, very glad to have you email me or call me at any time, and we will go from there. So have a great rest of your day. Enjoy your summer, and we'll be seeing you down the road. Thank you.